Great. Well, thanks everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the DC Tax Revision Commission. Again, just as a reminder, this is a public meeting. We're recording the meeting. The recording and the minutes will be posted on our website. I'm Nick Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Tax Revision Commission. I'm joined or will be joined by a number of members of the commission. Our commission chair is fresh off of throwing out the first pitch at the home opener of the Washington Nationals earlier this week, and it was a tremendous success from what I hear. And as I said a minute ago to the two of you, as it happens, our mayor released her budget earlier today. So I know a number of members of the commission will be not on this live, but will be, I've indicated that we're looking forward to catching up later via the recording. So thanks. Welcome to the members of the commission and to our guests from New Hampshire. I'll introduce you guys formally in a moment, but just to set the stage a little bit, this is the first of 3 briefing stations that we're doing with participants from New Hampshire. And the reason we're doing this, or one reason we're doing this, is that the commission is considering whether to recommend a business activity tax for the District of Columbia. And a possible model for this tax that has been suggested to us is New Hampshire's Business Enterprise Tax, BET. So we thought it might be helpful to hear from experts in the state of New Hampshire about your experience with the tax over the roughly 30 years that it's been in place. So this is the first of the 3 conversations. This coming Friday, we'll be talking with the New Hampshire Revenue Commissioner and a member of her team to get the administrative perspective on the tax. And then coming up on the 15th, we'll be talking with a panel of legislators from both sides of the aisle in New Hampshire to get their perspective. So today we're going to begin with 2 speakers who bring an independent perspective to our discussion. And the goals today really are to gain an overview of the BET and how it fits into New Hampshire's tax system and more generally its fiscal system, to understand why New Hampshire enacted the tax and continues to levy it, and to learn what stakeholders in New Hampshire think about it. So I have a few prepared questions that I will ask our speakers to get the conversation going. I know at least one of them has a couple of slides to share with us. And then we're going to open it up to members of the commission to ask questions. And we've committed to our speakers that we will wrap this up by 4 p.m. So we will hopefully have a really good conversation. Before I introduce today's panelists, I see Mayor Williams has joined the call. Is there anything you want to say at the outset?
No, just looking for the experience of New Hampshire in implementing the tax, how this fits into the other, the whole constellation of the whole tax system in New Hampshire. No implementation. I don't know whether it's you or some of your colleagues, how you're dealing with, we found issues with apportionment, how you deal with, for example, partnerships and apportionment of income for partnerships and kind of similar entities, but really excited to talk to you. You have a beautiful state, so thank you for spending time with us. Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm a big fan of Washington, D.C. too, so I'm honored to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do appreciate the invitation. And today you may be a little bit more beautiful than we are. It's been quite rainy, although we'll get a nice layer of snow by the time Friday morning rolls around.
Season up there, right? That's what I hear.
Very much so, yes.
So to introduce, I guess, formally, Phil Sletton is one of our panelists today. He's the research director at New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, where he has worked since 2016. Phil researches New Hampshire budget and revenue policy, the economy, and the financial well-being of the state's residents, as well as health policy. And before coming to New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, Phil served as a performance auditor for the New Hampshire Office of Legislative Budget Assistant, where he provided analysis to policymakers on a wide range of state agency operations. So Phil, thank you for joining us. Our other speaker is David Juvet. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Good. Well done.
Thank you. David is the Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Business and Industry Association of New Hampshire. He has been with the Business Lobbying Organization for nearly 25 years and has long guided public policy development and legislative activity for the association. So David, many thanks to you as well for being here this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank both of you. Thank you.
Phil, let me start with you, and maybe you can we'll step back and give us a bit of an overview. What is the New Hampshire business enterprise tax? How does it fit into New Hampshire's overall system of taxation?
Great. Thank you very much again for the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen and I'll be turning it off when Dave speaks so that he's not covered up by it, but hopefully I will be able to make the technology work smoothly for us here. So New Hampshire's business enterprise tax. What it is unique among state forms of business taxation. I don't know of any other state that has something quite like this, although there are different varieties on the traditional corporate income tax. Really, New Hampshire's business enterprise tax is designed to complement our more traditional corporate income tax, which is the business profits tax. And that actually has a credit for business enterprise tax paid. So for every dollar you pay in business enterprise tax, a business would typically pay the business enterprise tax first. And then for every dollar they pay in business enterprise tax, that's a dollar for dollar credit against the business profits tax, which is based on their net income as opposed to the BET. The business enterprise tax, or BET, as I'll refer to it in this presentation, is based on compensation or interest paid or accrued and dividends paid. And there's certain taxable amounts that are left after there are adjustments and that cross-border apportionment, right? That is part of the process for calculating BET. Now, compensation is the biggest part of it, so the tax base is largely based on compensation, and that, as defined in statute, is all wages, salaries, fees, bonuses, commissions, or other payments paid directly or accrued, with certain exceptions, that are paid by businesses. So basically, the largest portion of this tax base is wages. And as a result, it typically correlates with wages paid by employers in the state. The information that we have about the aggregate number, the aggregate dollar value of wages paid in New Hampshire the changes in that do correlate relatively closely most of the time with the business enterprise tax revenues from those same time periods. Right now, there is a filing threshold. There are actually two different filing thresholds. One is based on the actual business enterprise tax base as calculated, including that compensation piece and the interest and dividends paid or accrued. And the other part of it is gross receipts. So gross receipts can also trigger the filing threshold. Right now, those are set at $281,000. So anything under that doesn't require a filing. That is adjusted biennially for inflation. So that filing threshold does go up over time. And it has a relatively broad tax base. So in tax year 2021, it was likely about $40 billion was the tax base for the business enterprise tax. And relative to the size of the state's economy overall, which is around $100 billion, in gross state product, that is a relatively large tax base, right, compared to especially some other tax revenue sources. And Nick, did you want me to talk right now about where the BET fits in with the rest of the tax revenue sources in the state? Would that be helpful at this
Yes,
juncture?
please.
Okay,
That'd be great.
So if we look at all New Hampshire state revenues, and this is tax and non-tax revenue sources just for the state, the plurality, as you can see on this pie chart in the blue slice, is federal grants. That's the single largest source. Of course, that's made up of a whole array of different sources that are different federal grants for different purposes, including Medicaid matching dollars, right? That's all in here. But then you can see the next largest slices of the pie. Business profits tax is the next largest piece. And then liquor and lottery commission revenues, which are the two different shades of green. Those are the gross revenues from those. But we have state liquor stores that the profit generated from those does support other state activities. And we have a state lottery system that also the profits from those support public education in the state. And then some other tax revenue sources, the meals and rentals tax, which is basically a sales tax on hotel rooms, rental cars, and primarily restaurant meals. That's about 80% of the tax base. The Medicaid enhancement tax is a provider tax on hospitals that's used to match additional federal Medicaid dollars and pay for uncompensated care. And then you can see the next one is the business enterprise tax, right? Also shaded in orange. And the estimate for fiscal year 2023 is about $300 million for that. And then the smaller tax revenue sources, we have a statewide education property tax, a tobacco tax, a tax on purchasing and sales of real estate in the state. So that, and you can see the smaller ones balance that out. So if we take out all these the non-tax revenue sources and just look at taxes, here are our 10 largest tax revenue sources in the state. And you can see the business profits tax, our traditional state corporate income tax, is by far the largest. It has grown quite a bit over recent years. And you'll note that it's an estimate. We actually, one of the interesting things about how these two taxes interact, when we ask businesses, we as the state writ large, the state government asks businesses to pay these taxes in quarterly estimates as well as the final returns. And those quarterly estimate payments are made for both the business profits and business enterprise taxes, and they are typically paid together. And that means that we don't always know the exact breakdown on a fiscal year by fiscal year basis of what is business profits tax and what is business enterprise tax, because the filing entities don't have to say, right? They just provide a lump sum that is their combined business tax obligation for the quarter. So we don't always know the exact breakdown, which is why those two taxes have estimate listed next to them. But you can see the business enterprise tax is the fourth largest tax revenue source for the state. It would typically be fifth. There was a 1-year reduction in the statewide education property tax. And then the tobacco tax, real estate transfer tax, those have both been declining. Those are both above $200 million a year, which in New Hampshire is a significant amount of money. And then you can see the reduction below that. We have taxes that are less than $200 million a year, typically, including our gasoline and diesel tax. But this is just looking at state. If we look at state and local, and this slide sort of combines the whole story. If we look at state and local taxes paid in New Hampshire, the majority of tax revenue comes from local property taxes. You can see that that's about 56%, that largest slice of the pie. Statewide education property tax essentially functions as a local property tax. So that brings it to almost $6 and $10 paid in state and local taxes are through property taxes. And then you can see the business taxes combined, which are shaded together there in orange, make up sort of the remaining three quarters of the pie, that is business taxation and then property taxes, and the rest of the revenue sources, the tax revenue sources, balance out the remainder, including relative to other local taxes. There are very limited options that local governments have in New Hampshire. So that's the big picture, and I'll stop sharing for now and hand it back. But that's how that's in a nutshell how the state collects revenue and how the state and local governments combined collect revenue for services.
Thanks, Phil. That's really helpful to give us the big picture and the context, as well as a basic explanation of how the tax works. You pointed out that the business enterprise tax is not a tax that is common among states. It's a little different from what other states have. And David, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how this unusual tax came into existence. What were the economic factors, the fiscal factors, the economic factors that led to its coming about, and how has it stayed around all these 30 years? And I'm particularly sort of interested from the business and industry perspective, whether part of the success has been because it's helped offset perhaps pressure to raise other business taxes.
Yeah, let me answer that one right away. I think part of the reason for its success is it hasn't helped offset other business taxes. What it has helped offset is the implementation of a personal income tax, which we don't have here in New Hampshire. It came about in 1993, and it was the direct result of a lawsuit against the state by a large and influential company at the time called Cabletron. And Cabletron was suing the state over the fair and equitable treatment of like entities. New Hampshire has a fair and equitable treatment clause in its constitution. And Cabletron was arguing that of the tens of thousands of businesses that exist in New Hampshire, only a very small percentage paid the business profits tax or the corporate income tax, probably less than 10% of the total number of businesses in the state. And the 90+% of businesses were paying nothing in business taxation. And so they were arguing that that was unconstitutional on the basis of fair and equitable taxation. The case never actually was resolved by the court because the governor at the time, Steve Merrill, a Republican, after consulting with a number of organizations, business organizations, and others proposed a new tax called the business enterprise tax. And the design of it was such that it would capture all companies. The thresholds that Phil referred to exempt the state's smallest businesses, but those thresholds back when the tax was implemented were far smaller. So almost every company, regardless of size in New Hampshire, was paying something in state business taxes. In order not to increase the tax burden of those few companies that were already paying the business profits tax, part of the design was to provide that dollar for dollar credit. So, as Phil mentioned, whatever you paid in business enterprise tax, if you were also a BPT, a business profits taxpayer, you would get a dollar for dollar credit for that. So it didn't increase your tax burden. And that's how it came about. There are some ironies associated with it. One of which is that Steve Merrill was a very conservative Republican kind of anti-tax type governor, yet he was the one who proposed and cheerled the implementation of the business enterprise tax. The other is New Hampshire often characterizes itself as an income tax-free state. And to a certain extent, you could argue that we are, but business owners who pay the BET say, we may not have a personal income tax, but we certainly have a business income tax. And essentially, we're paying that income tax on behalf of our employees.
Thank you. Thanks, David. You pointed out the virtue of the part of the impetus of the tax was broadening the tax base. And in fact, one of the commission's concerned statutory directives is to think about ways to broaden DC's tax base. Phil, could you tell us a little bit about the characteristics of the businesses that do pay the tax? What do we see in the data about who's actually paying this tax, and maybe how that compares with the taxpayers that are paying the business profits tax, the tax on corporate net income?
Absolutely. And I'm going to lean on my slide deck again here to be able to show it graphically. So the business profits tax, the business enterprise tax does collect a fair bit of revenue from the largest filers, but it does have a relatively broad base. And as Dave noted, part of the purpose of it is to have that broader base and to capture, what otherwise might have been not considered profits otherwise under the business profits tax, but would be directed to compensation to capture some of that as well. And again, it has because it has such a broad base, it has quite a low rate. It started at 0.25% and went up to 0.75% and is now back down to a little over 0.5% at 0.55%. So, there are a lot of businesses captured underneath it, and it does provide a little bit more stability as a result. But if we look at the actual breakdown of the number of filers basically this is by the amount of tax that they paid. So if those numbers seem a little funky, it's because it's based on the actual amounts of tax that they paid in the different brackets reported by our state Department of Revenue Administration. But you can see that about $37 million came from 20 filers. If you look at that orange slice in the upper left, and then the next 250 or so filers paid $57 million. The next 3,000 paid about $80 million. And then we can get to the next 20,000 paying about 60 or a little under $60 million. And then the next 60,000 filers paying less than $10 million in total, right? These are the aggregate amounts that are paid. So a lot of business entities do end up filing, but don't necessarily end up paying very much in business enterprise tax. That being said, there are some that do pay a fair bit. If we look at filers by type, the categories that are reported by the state relative to the actual payers of the business enterprise tax and how they are categorizing themselves when they're filing their returns, we can see that proprietors paid about 8%, corporations paid about 30%, partnerships paid about 12%, fiduciaries paid a very small amount, And then half of the revenue came from combined reporting entities. So these are, in New Hampshire statute, they're called water's edge filers, as they are in other states. This doesn't necessarily mean that they have an overseas component, although if they did have an overseas component, this would how they would file. But this means that they're entities that have multiple different entities within them and are required to do combined reporting under New Hampshire law and law in many other states. So basically, they're complex multi-component entities that paid about half of the business enterprise tax in terms of total revenue collected. So that gives you a sense that these are probably large, probably multi-state, often multinational businesses. We can't say that definitively based on the filing, but we at least know that they're relatively complex and have multiple different components, whether it's multiple corporations or a corporation and a partnership incorporated within it. That's what that combined reporting slice means. If we look at the business profits tax, and remember the mix is a little bit different than it would be if we were just looking at a corporate income tax that in another state that didn't have something like a business enterprise tax, because the businesses that have a credit based on business enterprise tax paid then aren't contributing to the revenue picture of the business profits tax, although they're still filing. Here we can see, if we look at the business profits tax, the top echelon of filers, about 120 filers in tax year 2021 paid, you can see it's almost half, not quite half, but north of 40% of the revenue collected by the business profits tax. And then another nearly 1,000 filers paid another $258 million. So it gives you a sense that when we're talking about the business profits tax, we're talking much more about that top 1,000 and change filers paying 3/4 of business profits tax revenue. So again, a much less distributed, a much narrower base than the business enterprise tax. And if we look at the types of filers, what we know about the filer types based on those same categories, we can see that proprietors were about 5%, corporations were a little under 1/4, and partnerships about 15%. But those water's edge filers paid more than half of the business profits tax revenues. So not a dramatically different breakdown than we see from the BET, but again, a little bit more reliance in the business profits tax on those what are likely larger multi-state or multinational entities for the revenue collected.
That's very helpful. Gregory, I see your hand up, and we will have a chance for commissioners to ask deeper questions, but my guess is that you just have a clarification question.
I'll wait till the end then.
Okay. Well, Phil, building on that question, another of the commission's goals is to make recommendations that will help ensure that the DC tax system is resilient in a complicated economic moment. So maybe you could talk to us just a little bit about what the revenue experience, the revenue performance of the tax has been over time. Has it been relatively stable, relatively volatile, somewhere in between? And I know your lawmakers you mentioned have raised the rate and then dropped it a little bit, but sort of setting that aside, how has the revenue performance, to what degree has it kept pace with the growth of the economy there in New Hampshire?
Yeah, so if we look at how revenues have performed over time, especially relative to that tax base, remember I talked about how if we look at wages paid by employers in New Hampshire, and these are data that we know because of the unemployment compensation system in the state and participation in that. If we look at wages paid by private sector employers in New Hampshire, that's that blue line that you see on this graph. And this is all pegged relative to 2008. And the green line is business enterprise tax revenue. And you can see that except for where there are rate reductions, and the most recent year, I think there's still data that's being collected from tax year 2021 and processed around revenues for the business enterprise tax. But other than those two changes, right, other than sort of big changes in wages, again associated with inflation that we've seen since the pandemic, and big changes in the tax rate, we've seen that business enterprise tax revenue actually correlates pretty closely with wages that are paid in the state. So I would expect that business enterprise tax revenue over time will track relatively closely, at least in normal times, with the wages that we see paid. So relative to how that interacts with the rest of the economy, I mean, if wages were to go down, then we'd expect business enterprise tax revenue to go down as it did in aggregate. You could see following the Great Recession in 2009 and 2010 towards the left side of this graph. But it doesn't swing at nearly as much as, for example, the business profits tax. We've seen the business profits tax has substantially more revenue volatility over time. And that in the last decade or so has been on the upside in New Hampshire. There have been swings, you could see in 2016 and 2019, both of those followed rate reductions, but you can see that there are some places where the revenue spikes, some places where the revenue declines a little bit on that blue line, which is business profits tax revenue. And you can see the percentage changes year over year labeled there as well. Business enterprise tax revenue has been more stable. And that's true in percentage terms as well. If we look at both the average percentage change over this time period and the absolute value of the average percentage change over this time period. So ignoring whether it's a positive or a negative number and just taking the average relative to the prior year, the average change relative to the prior year, business enterprise tax revenues are more stable on the order of more of a 5 or 6% change as opposed to business profits tax revenues, which have more likely a 10 or 12% change on average relative to the prior year. And that's not a situation that's unique to New Hampshire. Typically, corporate income tax revenues are among the more volatile tax revenue sources that states have. The business enterprise tax is obviously a little bit of a different animal, and as we can see, at least in the New Hampshire experience, it's been more stable.
Thanks, Phil. David, in just a second, I'm gonna give commissioners a chance to ask questions of their own, Gregory, and also maybe address the question that Mary Williams raised at the beginning about apportionment and partnerships. But maybe, David, can you just say a few words about how business taxpayers view the tax?
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to generalize about sort of which types of businesses view it as more burdensome, less burdensome? Do people find that taxes filing requirements to be difficult? And I mean, I'd love you to speak about business taxpayers, but also if you have anything you want to say about sort of general public sentiment or lack thereof about the tax, or if the general public is even aware of it.
Yeah, let me answer that one first. If you're not a business owner and paying this tax, you've never heard of it, you would have no way of knowing about it. All you know is that you don't pay a personal income tax, but you don't really know why, other than saying it's a New Hampshire tradition that we don't tax personal income. Business owners are very aware of it. It's sort of hard to characterize how they feel about it because the universe of taxpayers that love paying taxes is relatively small. The criticisms that you often hear from businesses is this is a tax. First of all, it's an income tax, and so they say it's hypocritical for New Hampshire to say we don't have an income tax. It's not really an income tax, but as Phyllis said, it's based in large part on compensation. Beyond that, it's a tax that if you've had a bad year, you still have to pay the tax. There's nothing about this tax that is based on profitability. So regardless of how good a year you had, you still have to pay the tax, which many business owners resent, especially those who are just starting out, brand new businesses that may take some time for the business to get up and running. The other criticism that is a little, I think is legitimate, is that the criteria that's used to determine the tax is the same criteria that you would measure business growth. So growth in compensation, growth in number of employees, growth in interest paid on investments, so on. And so some businesses would say this taxation, rather than we should be taxing things that we don't want to have happen, like sin taxes, taxes on liquor, taxes on cigarettes, and so on. Why are we punishing a business for growing?
Can I piggyback on that? Have you seen
Sure.
an impact on growth of new businesses over this 30-year period? Is it pretty much consistent with other states?
Yeah,
Has it in fact affected new business growth?
it's a good question, Mayor. My observation would be no. As Phil mentioned, the tax rate itself, 0.55% is a very low rate, and that was by design. Um, and the reality is, if your business is growing and more money is flowing into the business, your business enterprise tax liability is a relatively small amount. But if you hear criticisms from business people, that's one of the criticisms you'll hear, whether it's justified or not. Probably
What
depends
about the
on.
criticism? Not only are you disincentivizing growth, but if you want people employed in New Hampshire, why are you taxing me the more people I hire?
Well, that's the criticism right there is the criticism. The 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 reality though is if businesses are growing and hiring people to meet the increased demand, the impact of a higher business enterprise tax on that decision is a minimal one.
And what would, can I, just one more question? Where would, I know you must keep track of this, where does New Hampshire stack up in terms of, and I know, economists would all argue about what calculation you're gonna use, but in terms of just general business burden, where would it be? With the BET as it is and all the other, like the business profits, where would it stack in term, among the states on terms of business burden?
Well, it depends on how you measure, and then I'll turn it over to Phil because he and I may have a difference of opinion on this. I'm not sure, but if you look at all the state taxes that are levied, the ones that bring in the most income, and I'm separating out what we get from the federal government and just talking about state taxation. The ones that bring in the most income at the state level are business taxes, the combined receipts from the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax. So and that doesn't even take into account property taxes that businesses pay or rooms and meals taxes that businesses pay. Just the business taxes are by far the largest contributor to overall state tax revenue. Whether you would characterize that as burdensome, I'm not sure, because we have other things like no sales tax, so businesses aren't paying sales tax on products that they buy for their businesses. We have no state personal income tax, so CEOs, managers, and employees aren't paying a tax on personal income. So it's hard to measure the burden, but we can say that the two business taxes raise the most revenue for the state of New Hampshire.
And you would have provision for a low margin business, like let's say I'm a supermarket, I got huge receipts, but low margin, I'm not getting penalized. See what I'm saying?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. And low margin
So your
companies
answer would be it's such a low number, it's really not gonna have
correct,
an impact. Deterrent impact on.
but that has been, another criticism. Companies like hotels, for example, that have large staff for housekeeping and so on, or grocery stores that have a large staff for checkout and restocking shelves, they would say we are unduly burdened by the BET, the way that it is set up. But counterbalancing that is the very low tax rate that it has. I don't know. Phil, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so relative to the overall tax burden that businesses face in New Hampshire, there are lots of different rankings out there, and as you noted, economists have different ideas as to which ones are more valuable and which ones are more meaningful. The Council on State Taxation does have some rankings that are a little bit more sophisticated in that they include sort of the revenue devoted from business taxes to things that support businesses, so for example, like education systems. New Hampshire doesn't rank in an extreme in their rankings, at least the last version that I saw. But one of the things the Council on State Taxation does break down is if we look at the total number of dollars paid by businesses in New Hampshire in state and local taxes, and that's the total number of dollars paid in aggregate, so not what each individual tax bill is, because it does vary from business to business. The business profits and business enterprise tax combined, and remember the BET is a small portion of that, a minority of that. The business profits and business enterprise tax combined are about a quarter of the tax dollars paid in the state and local taxes by businesses in New Hampshire, but property taxes are half, right? So property taxes are, I would say, and Dave talks to more businesses than I do on a regular basis, but I have heard from businesses that say the business taxes, yes, those exist, but the property taxes are really what is impacting us. And that, again, depends on the type of business it is and the type of business that they're doing in the state.
And which town you're located in.
Right, because so much of it is local property taxes, right? Local property taxes being that more than half. So, and that is to say too, I've heard varying things from business owners as to whether they are more impacted by the business profits or the business enterprise tax. The business profits tax tends to get a little bit more attention because it is substantially larger in terms of the revenue that it collects. And those larger entities, may be focused on it more because they are paying more in business profits tax than in business enterprise tax. Relative to how they affect the economy, as the business enterprise tax has been lowered, if we look at the 1990s, there is some correlation between a lower business enterprise tax rate and revenue and job growth, but that is just, again, mostly affected by the 1990s and the fact that our rate went from 0.25% to 0.75% because of some requirements upon the state based on education funding that happened in the late 90s and the early 2000s. That essentially tripling of the rate. I don't know that slowed job growth any more than any other factors would have in the economy at that time. I say I don't know because I don't know, but at least based on the data that I looked at, it would be hard to disaggregate that from other economic factors that were going on at that time period, because that was the late 90s into the 2000s. There was a recession and there was an inflection at that point too. So, but I can say that if we look at the rate reductions that we've seen since 2015 on both the relative to the business enterprise tax, those rate reductions have not generated more economic activity than that would be enough to offset the lost revenue from the business enterprise tax. That's something that we see in the data, is that reducing the rate has not unlocked a lot of additional hiring. So that I can say more definitively than just what the overall impact has been. But usually I hear more about the business profits tax than the business enterprise tax.
There's another reason for that. It's a little easier to compare New Hampshire's business profits tax with other states' corporate income taxes. Almost every state has some form of corporate income tax, not all, but by far the majority. And so we have they're all administered slightly differently, but they're similar. And it allows us to compare what we're doing here in New Hampshire with other competitor states.
At this time, why don't we open it up to other commissioners? We have also on the line Gregory McCarthy, James Hudson. I saw Jody McLean was on for a little bit. She may be coming back on. And Gregory, you had your hand up earlier. Why don't I start with you?
Okay, thank you. That was a great presentation, gentlemen. Thank you. So did I hear it right? Did you say that 90% of the businesses in your state did not pay the business profits tax? Did I hear that correctly? Or was it?
Yeah, I think I was one that said that.
Okay.
That was back in the early 90s. And the reason why is the companies that were paying the business profits tax were generally larger companies that had salaried executives, W-2 salaried executives. And so it was easy to determine what profit was, and you would then pay that. Other companies where the owner of the company was not a W-2 salaried employee would just take whatever was left over at the end of the year, and that was their compensation. So therefore, there was no profit.
So I noticed in one of the pie charts you had, I think of your business profit tax, there was a couple hundred million or something for partnerships that were covered by that as well. And just for background, you know, I'll just speak for myself. One of the things that I find appealing about this concept is a way to tax heretofore untaxed partnerships here in the city. In New Hampshire, you have, they're not taxed as income because of a state policy, you know, decided by your elected leaders. Here, that decision was made by virtue of a prohibition from Congress that we're not allowed to tax income of non-residents. And we have perhaps a situation you don't, which is a lot of people earning income in the city don't reside here. So what at the time you did this, and that was 30 years ago, so perhaps things have changed, was capturing some people who may fall into one of those categories an explicit reason for the tax, or were they adequately covered in the business profit tax to start with? And then just I'll tag on to that something where Mayor Williams is going. Insofar as you have cities that are located near other states nearby, we have that here to a tremendous degree. Did you find any relocation of businesses as a reaction back to this 30 years ago?
I mean, Phil, can I start it, then I'll turn it over to you?
Yep.
So we don't have that requirement. You don't have to be a resident of New Hampshire to pay business taxes. What you need is a business nexus in the state, some type of business activity that takes place in the state, regardless of where you live. That's what triggers the tax. So we don't. That's different from Washington, D.C. Phil, do you want to respond to other areas?
Yeah, so just relative to the cross-border piece as well, New Hampshire's in a different situation than DC is in that while we do have a fair number of people who commute to New Hampshire to work, we are a net exporter of people who are going to work really in metropolitan Boston is the primary place where we're a net exporter to. So I imagine that some of the calculus relative to our tax structure, to the extent that it creates incentives for people or businesses to locate in different places, is a little bit flipped in terms of people aren't commuting to us on net, they're commuting out from New Hampshire, again, typically to Eastern Massachusetts on net there. One thing, and you had asked about the some of the summary statistics around how many businesses actually pay a business enterprise tax and business profits tax. The latest numbers, and I pulled them up here from the Department of Revenue Administration for 2021, approximately 188,000 businesses in New Hampshire have registered with the Secretary of State as in good standing or active status in New Hampshire. That's an expansive number, right? But if we look at the number of business entities that actually filed tax returns, that's a little under 83,000. So we've gone from that 188,000 to 83,000, and then about 32,000 of those didn't end up paying any business profits or business enterprise tax, even though they filed, right? They met the filing threshold, but they had a credit that may have wiped out their liability. And then about 2,300 of those businesses, of the businesses in total, paid about 80%, 78% of combined business profits and business enterprise tax revenue. So even though there's a very broad base and a lot of entities that are interacting with the business enterprise tax, and remember, I'm talking also about combined business profits and enterprise tax here. It's a relatively small percentage of total businesses that are paying a very significant amount. If we look at the revenue side from the governmental perspective, it's a smaller group of entities. That being said, if we look at even the amount that's paying none, we're talking about 51,000 businesses that owed something out of the potentially 188,000 total.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And before the business enterprise tax was created, that was more lopsided, right? That was part of the lawsuit in the early 1990s.
Commissioner Hudson, anything you want to jump in with? Oh, you're on mute, Jim.
maybe it's a baseline question. If New Hampshire had a personal income tax, would these taxes be on the table?
I think, well, the business profits tax would certainly still exist. I don't know that you could have a personal income tax and a business enterprise tax at the same time. But that would probably be tested in court, because one would be considered a personal tax on income and the other would be considered a business tax that's based on compensation of the company. But I can tell you, just sort of the real world is a lot of business owners here would resent having to pay the business enterprise tax based on their compensation, but also having to pay personal income tax based on their compensation. And essentially you'd be taxed twice for the same income.
And I think one of the I also don't know the answer to the point that Dave raised around the legal arguments around it. One of the considerations here that I don't have the empirical research to be able to point to, but for some entities, for some businesses that will hire people across borders, it's often an open question as to whether in our surrounding states that do have personal income taxes, wages are higher in those states for, again, people who are paying, more likely to be paying income taxes. The wages around us at the low end of the income spectrum tend to be higher because our surrounding states have considerably higher minimum wages than we do. But if we look at beyond the very bottom, if we look at median income and upper income, do businesses adjust their wages that they pay based on whether the employment is happening on the New Hampshire side of the border or across the border in a state that has a personal income tax? And I don't know the empirical answer to that question. I've heard stories about both sides, right?
I could tell you, I don't have empirical evidence either, but I have no doubt that it's happening. I used to be a Massachusetts resident working in Massachusetts, and I was lured to New Hampshire by a company, not the one I'm currently employed by, but by a company. And when we got to the salary part, which was lower than my expectation, they reminded me, well, you won't be paying state income taxes up here. So everything you make, you get to keep. So I know that businesses use that up here is a hiring tool, which I think contributes to why efforts to implement an income tax have never really got any traction in this state.
A related question, Mayor Williams raised the question of apportionment earlier. And I know there are complicated formulas, and if I remember right from looking at it, it's the fact that the different factors the apportionment rules are a little bit different. But can you speak to that at all? I mean, and maybe to think about a specific example, if an employer is in this era of remote work, if you're an employer in New Hampshire and one of your employees says, hey, look, I live in, just over the border in Maine. I'd like to work from home all the time and not have to come into the office. Does that affect what they owe in business enterprise tax liability? Is that are people raising that concern about how this era of increased remote work is going to affect BET revenues?
Dave, go ahead.
I don't think so, because the tax is based on compensation, and all the job is considered New Hampshire sourced, even though the worker, the employee, may be doing it remotely in Maine. So I don't know that it would have an impact, but you mentioned that you were having Lindsay step on, and that would be a great question to ask the commissioner too. I know that in terms of the business profits tax, and I won't go into the weeds because that's not the subject of this discussion, apportionment formulas are a big deal. And New Hampshire recently moved to and is implementing what's called single sales factor apportionment. And that's, the jury is out on what that will do to business profits tax revenues. We don't really know yet. Everyone's sort of looking nervously at what happens.
And I'll note, just to add more of the jargon that I think is familiar to some in this group, we also shifted recently to market-based sourcing as well. So our apportionment formula has been in flux, and relative to, I would say, Dave, relative to the prior 15-year period,
Yes.
has had quite a bit of change over the last 5 years.
Very, very much, but I think that has more of an impact on business profits tax than business
Yes.
enterprise tax.
Yes, I agree. But I think these are very good questions for Commissioner Stepp, especially with the knowledge that they have that of seeing the tax returns, right, as opposed to us that are seeing the public facing side of the data. And I would say as well, when it comes to the cross-border piece, we are a net exporter of employees, right? So there are people who are paying income tax that's earned across borders. They're not paying New Hampshire income tax, but they may be paying income tax in Massachusetts, for example, if they're working in Massachusetts. And for a business entity outside of it, they may, they don't necessarily have the business enterprise tax to think about when there comes to that payment, because if they're based entirely outside, they're not included in the scope. That being said, for people who come to New Hampshire to work, then yes, business enterprise tax applies based on those businesses that are based in the state, have that nexus, as Dave referred to, and owe business enterprise tax based on that compensation paid. So because, like DC, although we aren't quite as geographically compact, we have small states with a lot of cross-border activity. These are considerations, and that's part of why those apportionment formula changes do catch quite a bit of attention here. But I do think Commissioner Stepp will be able to unpack that with a lot more detail than we can as well.
Yeah, that helpful to help us think about the questions that we'll be asking them as well on Friday. I have one more question that I could finish up with, but let me just see, Gregory, Tony, Jim, do you guys want to get in the last question? Maybe just looking forward, curious, and you can answer this either as what you'd like to see happen or what you predict will happen, or both. What do you see as the future for this tax? Is this pretty much set in as part of your revenue system, or is there a live debate that we should be aware of where things may be changing in the future?
I think the debate, to the extent that there is one, is what the appropriate tax rate for the business enterprise tax should be. As Phil mentioned, it's gone up, it's come back down. But I cannot see any scenario where the BET would go away absent the implementation of a tax on personal income. It's a part of our fabric is business owners in the state.
I agree with Dave that I think the rate is still an unsettled question. It has dropped substantially since 2015, and as I noted, it was tripled in the late 1990s and early 2000s. That was in response to a lawsuit related to school funding and funding education at the local level. The state found a bunch of different ways to raise money by tacking on to existing taxes and making a couple other smaller taxes as well. And including the statewide education property tax. So those changes, I think, force some of this conversation. I expect that there are several large potential revenue needs, including another education funding lawsuit that we don't know the answer to what that will be. But I think a lot of the conversation around some of our larger revenue sources is on hold. And we've also been actively reducing revenue sources quite a bit over the last 8 years. And we are phasing out entirely our state's interest and dividends tax, which is the only personal income tax the state has, and that's due to go away next year. So I suspect, and while there is definitely discussion about what the rates are for a lot of these tax revenue sources, I expect that a lot of policymakers will be hesitant to actively reduce revenue sources in the next few years because we don't know where the business profits tax revenues are going to go, and because of their volatility, and we don't know what national corporate profits are going to look like. and also that there are potentially significant costs in a couple different categories that are on the horizon. We'll have to see how those shake out. You know, they could end up not being as significant a cost as the risks are, but as the risks suggest, and that of course then would reopen some discussion about lowering tax rates as opposed to raising them, or at least holding them steady. But I agree with Dave. I don't think that this tax is going away anytime soon. I think because of the substantial rate changes we've seen over time, that's still very much an open question. And I know that there are some who have proposed additional rate changes as recently as earlier this year, but those have been put on hold pending some of these bigger issues, and that we're not in a budget season this year.
Well, thank both of you so much for joining us today. I know it's not part of your job to educate those of us from other parts of the country. So we're deeply grateful. Thank you. Thank you for your clear and very illuminating explanations of these issues. They'll really help us, I think, as we think through how this might apply here in the District of Columbia. Thank you to other commissioners for joining us today, and just appreciate you all wrapping up right and 2 minutes before 4 o'clock. Couldn't be better. And have a great day. Stay dry and stay warm.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you for your time. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.